Hello, everybody. My name is Jonathan Jennings, and this is a little talk I put together for a recent class that I was invited to speak at. Unfortunately, there was a scheduling mix-up, so I couldn't present it, and I figured I'd share the content here on YouTube instead. This talk was primarily created with high schoolers graduating to college and new college students in mind, and really those curious about game development in general, and aimed at those curious about entering the industry. Um, as well as those curious about the life, background, and work of a game designer and game programmer. So, without further ado, here's copying, iterating, and sharing a look at my professional nerd game dev journey. So, I think it's always an important question: who am I, and why am I? Why is my advice or insight even valuable? So I'm Jonathan Jennings. I've been a software engineer and game designer for the past 10 years. I've published over 22 titles, from mobile games back on the iPhone 3GS to more recent indie game titles on itch.io. I'm a writer and have written two published essays, Black Unicorn and They Were Wrong About Me So They Can Be Wrong About You, which are both essays kind of describing my experience as a black programmer in the game industry. I'm also a public speaker. I've spoken at several colleges or private boot camps. I'm also a teacher. I work with Game Dev HQ to educate and mentor their students and help them direct them as they enter the job market and first kind of embrace Unity and develop a professional online profile. And then I'm also a podcaster on the Zero to Play podcast, where I get the opportunity to interview different game developers about their experiences in the industry from all over the world. I'm also the 2021 Blacks United Lead Technology Innovator of the Year. I also was a member of the 2021 Oculus Launchpad cohort, and I won a grant for our game, for my contributions to our game Supersonic Rhyme Chamber. I also spoken at LA Comic Con, PAX Prime, several colleges, and like the Jamaican Game Developers Society, like I said, several organizations from all over the world and country. Yeah, I've worked on over 22 games and apps and a few animated TV shows, which have gotten millions of views and downloads all over the world. And I always like to shore that up, even though I have all these like accolades and whatever. Truly, I'm just a professional nerd who loves video games, and I've loved video games for a long time. This is a picture of me and my cousins. I've loved video games ever since I was super tiny. Been playing games since I was about 3 years old, and before I knew how to hold a controller before I ever even knew how to read. I was a huge gaming magazine reader growing up, and so the opportunity to be able to talk with, learn from, and participate in creating games with others, and teach others about game development keeps me very happy, and it speaks to my inner child, who you can see here with my little grin. And it keeps him grinning like that still ever since I was 5 years old or so when this picture was taken. So I really love my role in the game industry and the opportunities I've gotten to work on and teach people about game development. So here's a peek into my real past work, which starts with some of my first hobbyist and college class projects and evolves into some of my first professional mobile game projects. And then we start to display some of my more recent virtual reality work as of 2021. We'll discuss several of the games I created and display that I've created and that are displayed in the reel today, as well as a few that aren't in the reel. So here's a collection of my past work. so that's some of my past work. And while this talk is going to be entirely about game development specifically, currently I'm working in the virtual production area, which you might have heard of if you've heard anything about kind of the Mandalorian virtual production or the Jungle Book virtual production, which is largely just recording film and TV performances using games technology tech. And so my current role is at a company called Mindshow, where I work on an animation software tool built on top of the Unity game engine. We've created multiple shows with this animation tool, and here I'm demonstrating the process of 3 stages of an animated show production. This first image is a ghost image of me possessing a puppet character and waving to the camera to record a performance using our Mindshow tool. This is the output from an MP4 file from my perspective, showcasing, of course, my third-person perspective from the camera's view and not the puppet I was possessing. And then this is, the MP4 view of the exported video. And then all of that turns into this Hot Wheels City clip where you can kind of see what our final post-production version, release version of the Hot Wheels City episode looks. And I just thought this was a neat snippet to share because I've been really in love with working in the virtual production space for the last bit. And so, just wanted to share a little bit about kind of what I'm working on today, besides my own indie game projects. Okay, so 6 things that we're going to try to cover today, and 6 questions we're going to try to answer today actually are the first one: what does some of the actual work of game design look like? It can be kind of abstract and unclear, and I hope I can demonstrate a few different specific game designer roles that happen on games. This, of course, isn't conclusive and complete, but this is just a talk about a few different things that game designers do on games. Secondly, what is the value and usage of code in building a game? Code is a little more visually clear in terms of what it is due to media demonstrations of hackers and whatnot, but I think understanding how code is a part of game development may be useful for some to understand. Third, I want to touch upon the idea of what I call copycat learning or learning by emulation. Really just modeling and recreating functionality from games you love to help you on your own creative journey and kind of further develop your creative voice using the experience and knowledge you glean from games you already love. After that, I want to speak to the value of iteration and why not getting it perfect the first time is a natural part of most games' progression cycles, with a few case studies of how games I have worked on in the past have evolved over time to become their best versions. And then lastly, I want to discuss the value of sharing and discussing your work and sharing and discussing your work often, and why I believe doing so can help your professional network as well as possibly assist your creative vision as it grows and evolves. Before we dive into answering these questions, though, I'd like to discuss my 2 primary professional hats, which are game design and programming. As I've described, my 2 main hats are game design and programming. And so these are 2 different screenshots. This one, it kind of just demonstrates a bunch of projects I've worked on, some as a designer, some as a programmer, but just generally quite a few games I've worked on in general over time. And then this is a small screenshot showing my AI shooting logic in my game Galactic Bar Fight. And so of the 2 hats, I would definitely concede I'm a stronger programmer than game designer, but I really enjoy designing and creating games, and I'd like to highlight some of the most important aspects of each role as I've done a little bit of each. So when it comes to game design, I would say the most important thing to remember is that game design is all about being able to create compelling and interesting systems of rules for our players to participate in. When I mention the word mechanics, I'm just referring to the rules and systems driving the gameplay experience. On the other hand, when it comes to code, comparatively, The important thing to remember is that code is simply a set of instructions delivered to the processor, and that govern how a game or experience functions on a technical system level. And so, I included this Mario screenshot to kind of depict an example of uh, to show the distinction between game design for this mechanic and then the actual logic that had to go into making this mechanic work. And so the way I differentiate between game design and the implementation of the Super Mario Star mechanic is that the game mechanic or ability would be the power up star item and its considerations, and how the idea that when a player as Mario touches it, they become invincible, and considering how that's going to affect our players and how they play during that invincibility window. If you're anything like me, you run through the level at full speed, only watching for the infinite pits to avoid. Instead, in terms of code or logic, the instructions happening in the process system would say that when Mario's star ability is active, he does not take damage from enemies, and he kills them upon touch. And every time Mario touches an enemy, a check happens under the hood that asks, is Mario still invincible? And if so, continue not to take damage as Mario and kill any enemies who touch him. So it's just kind of more the expression of the rules and instructions to the system saying that, hey, if Mario's invincible, anything that touches him dies. And so with that brief clarification, let's look at a few examples of design for games that I've worked on in the past. Yeah, so this is the first game I've worked on as a professional, which was Animal Planet Wildlands, an educational card game built for the iPhone 3GS and designed by my favorite designer to work with, Valmore Riera. Our game designer's job in this situation was to come up with some systems to make exploring and participating in our Animal Planet world fun and engaging. And in order to do that, he outlined those in a document we call the game design document, which I'm going to have I won't get into the specifics of the game design document, but I will attach a link to one I use as a learning resource. And the document at its heart is made to define what a game experience will be. And so this is kind of an example of what a game design document looks like, and this is actually a piece of the game design document for Animal Planet. So in Animal Planet, there are 4 in-game areas, and each area has 3 main core mechanics, which kind of give players a variety of things to do within our game experience. The first mechanic involves collectibles and collecting a full set of puzzle pieces in a given area. We can see that happening in the top image with the kangaroo. So this one. This mechanic encourages exploration and trying different animals who can access different areas of the world. And as you can see, we use our kangaroo to kind of collect that puzzle piece. And I believe there are 9 puzzle pieces all together in a given area. The second mechanic is the herd mechanic, which is both visually fun to see, which makes it both visually fun to see your animals and their numbers instantaneously multiplying, but it also increases their strength and to avoid being taken down by predators or in order to take down larger herbivores. You can see that in the second image with our herd of elephants and pride of lions. And so kind of the way this mechanic works is that if one lion can't take down an elephant, but if you spawn 3 lions, they might be able to take down an elephant. And that kind of just creates a hierarchy system within our game. And how you can see 5 animals here allow you to build a herd, and the herd just has increased strength to your actual animal character. That actually ties into our third and final mechanic, which involves a hierarchy of animals who can defeat other animals based on their size and carnivorous nature. Animals who are smaller and or weaker. Animals who are carnivores or omnivores can take down herbivores who are smaller and or weaker than them. And if an herbivore is larger, for example, our hyena to the left taking on an elephant, then maybe maybe the single hyena can't take it down, but maybe a herd of hyenas can take it down. And so you can kind of see the hyena taking down the antelope here, and one of the what the quest is to take down 10 animals in a given area, um, using your omnivore or carnivorous animal. So our second example of the work of game design is a little more simple. This is Sonder's Story, which is a point-and-click adventure game that I developed with Team Hot Clock for the Game Jam Ludum Dare 48. And for this game, I was the lead engineer, and I asked the designers to draw me a mock-up diagram to create a test bed for our game mechanics, our kind of point-and-click mechanics. They gave me the top left image showing a mock-up with room with red touchable spots, which our player would select to investigate objects and explore the main character's room. I took this mock-up diagram, created the bottom clickable prototype, which mimicked the functionality described by our designers, and after some further technical design and polish, we were able to produce the final product of Sonder to the right side image, on the right side image showing exploring the room and selecting an item to learn more about it. And in this case, the game design job, right, was to give me this diagram, kind of showing what example environment looks like, and showing the different placement of objects within the scene to be selected. Here's the prototype with all the different items, kind of test items I had as like a simple item selection prototype. And then when it was all said and done, this is the final iteration of that kind of execution of the prototype and ability to move around the room and select an item to view it forward. And so I did want to express the point that establishing the interactions or mechanics that drive the experience of playing your game is part of the work of game design. The most important question you should ask yourself before building a game is, what will my players do? Play as a verb or action word? And I think it's important to always be aware of the interactive nature of your game and how you would like your players to participate. And then third, what does game design look like in terms of map design? And so this third example of game design work also involves game designers drawing, but in this case, the drawings are for map design. This is the second game I worked on in my career, called Monsterology, also made for the iPhone 3GS and also designed by Valmore Riera. Monsterology was a card-based strategy RPG for mobile phones, and was as such, the map design required a few things, such as knowing how to position enemies in a way to encourage encounters with players, knowing where to put chests in relation to enemies to encourage players to explore areas in order to gain currency or new items so that they could purchase more cards and get more monsters, knowing where to put towers to complete the level, and even placing healing towers where player monsters when player monsters needed some help and support during combat. And so this is kind of the map. Oh man, this is the map dealing with this is the map for a Monsterology level. This is kind of the key outlining what's going on here in this map, and which our game designer would have to draw up to kind of envision how experiences and encounters and battles would be set up, and how to create a path to make sure the player has some sort of combat or combat experience in this level. And then this is kind of the execution again, right? So this is a screenshot of our player monster and their movement radius. There's also some smaller images of monsters in the background, and then here's a better screenshot. You can kind of see the teleportation level ending space. You can see a tower here, which you can heal or which you can fix for as a objective, I believe. And then this is, of course, our player monster and an enemy monster fighting. And I feel like map and world design can be overlooked as a critical aspect of game design. But really, designing a play space that encourages your players to use a variety of mechanics is such an important part of the job. And you can see some screenshots of the mapped out level drawing on the level to the mapped out level drawing of the level to the finished product on the right. I say all of this to highlight the work of game design as not just conceptually creating an idea for a game, but being able to come up with compelling mechanics that encourage your players to play with and explore your world. Drawing diagrams to outline a vision of the gameplay and to outline the best way to design and structure an environment to make sure your players have a certain type of gameplay experience and can mentally create the paths that define that gameplay experience. And so, really, you just want to make a level that as engaging and encourages players to use all of their abilities and explore all the mechanics as possible within a level's area. And so, the value of map design is very important in any game. And so, then I want to shift a little bit and focus and briefly talk about code and what it is. And I'm going to admittedly keep this brief to save non-programmers from being bored, but I also wanted to highlight what the kind of core act of writing code, or really instructions, looks like, and how that code is processed and acted on from the computer standpoint from a high level. Code at its core is simply a set of instructions, and these instructions are for a machine to process and drive the way a game experience looks. Something as simple as when the player presses the A button, call a jump function, is an example of said instructions. The example code I'm showing is an example of an instruction within the code that says to print to the debug log console the quoted text, which is "thank you for watching." And so if I would call example function somewhere in my code, it would print out to our debug log, "thank you for watching," and you can put that text in a text field somewhere in your game. You can make it show up wherever you want, but really the core instruction is, "Hey, I want you to log this to our debug console. Thank you for watching." It's very straightforward. It's a very straightforward and simple example, and ultimately, using logical steps like this, you can build larger systems on top of several dozen, hundred, or even thousands of these instructions. And that's kind of what code is at its core. And so, this is Thunderjack Log Runner, a twitchy mobile action game that came out in 2015, and I tried to set up this page to showcase the relationship between code I wrote and how that logic actually functions and presents itself at runtime. So for Thunderjack's Log Runner, as far as kind of the mechanic being demonstrated here, or the feature being demonstrated here, we randomly would generate 3 challenges every time a player starts a new run, kind of like a randomized challenge in a roguelike. When the player completes a challenge, the notification pops up as seen on the right, and the notification itself describes the kind of completed challenge so the player can be informed on their objective success. To the far left, you can see a screenshot of some code I wrote defining various notification types. And so these notifications in general fall into like five general buckets. So the first one is a basic completed objective notification for general randomized challenges completion. And so this is an example of that. A simple randomized objective was something like collect 15 fish underwater, which happened here, and you can see the way the objective banner spawned and kind of informs the player of that. The unlock bonus level notification, which lets player know they have a chance to visit the coin run area and collect a bunch of in-game currency. You can see an example of that one here, and that's also the example here on this kind of GIF. You can also there's also an unlocked new area notification to show players they unlocked a new area to explore, and an items available in store notification, which would show up when the game updated with new items and costumes. And also a reward earned notification for when a player earned a special type of reward of some type. And so the underlying code would make a call to my notification system and tell it, hey, the player has accomplished a challenge of this type, and it's named this. And then those instructions would be used to spawn and show the notification to the player, kind of as demonstrated here. Well, not a super detailed example. I just kind of wanted to briefly cover just a visual example of how the logic under the hood in the background um, translate to the actual feature kind of demonstrated on the surface level. And it's always kind of hard to articulate exactly the role of code. And so I hope with this very simple example, I was able to give kind of a snapshot into like, I write the code here, and this is what the code outputs to, and what these parameters kind of are assigned to define here. Learning a new creative skill can be very challenging. And one thing I find with new creatives often is that they stress themselves out to create something completely brand new and never thought of. And personally, I found I learn the most when I emulate features and aspects of games I love and exist already. And by emulating those features, that taught me how the games I love are built and helped me to better understand how to build new gameplay features by building on the experience I learned replicating games I've already seen. Um, I just want to make a footnote because plagiarism is different from emulation. Emulation is taking from and recreating your own version of of an idea or vision of an idea. Plagiarism is copying someone else's idea and taking credit for it. And I just want to make sure I make that distinction because sadly, creative work is stolen all the time. And so here I'll begin showing you examples of me emulating games I love side by side with the games I love. Um, so yeah, this is my first original game was a platformer in Game Maker titled The Amazing Sketchbook. My two primary influences for the game were Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and Super Mario Bros. 3, some of my favorite platformers of all time. I'm emulated a lot of mechanics from both. Platforms that follow or sync when touched, a checkpoint system so when players die, they don't have to start from the beginning, jumping mechanics, and more. The most satisfying and educational thing I emulated, though, was the structure of boss fights and the way bosses show that they've taken damage from the player, as kind of demonstrated here. I love how simple yet obvious the damage flash for bosses are in both games. When you attack a boss, they briefly pause, flash, and that gives players a moment to reset, celebrate, and get ready to continue the fight or give the boss a chance to change forms. And by replicating this, I learned little about pacing, switching animations, and AI states for an enemy. I learned how to make them invincible during a damage flash. And I learned how to keep a boss engaging yet not overwhelming as a player hits them multiple times. I simply borrowed from the boss fights of games I loved, and that allowed me to create a boss fight that I was happy with. And so, as you can see here, right, the mini boss in Mario Brothers 3, Super Mario Brothers 3, and Robotnik or 8-Man in Sonic the Hedgehog 2, I used kind of what I learned there to create this kind of damage flash when you would hit the tank boss enemy in Amazing Sketchbook. And it served as a way to kind of emulate and demonstrate what I learned from the games I loved growing up. And so another example of me copying a game I love was me developing Paper Aviator, which happened about a year into my professional career as a way to learn how to create an on-rails flight system for a game like Star Fox 64. I wanted to understand how to make an object follow a path through a level on a rail and how to make sure the camera stayed stuck behind the object, and also how to constrain the motion of the object within the camera view, and how to place collectibles that encourage player movement around the on-rail screen. After the player collects the origami birds, which you can see here in the corner, kind of an example of them being collected, I give them a score at the end of the game as well, which I took from Star Fox's rank system, and kind of a way they save stats between levels. Paper Aviator only had one level, but it was more kind of an exploratory game. And ultimately, in this case, I copycatted a game I loved to understand how to build games within a certain genre. And I had a lot of fun learning how to build on Rails games. Star Fox and Panzer Dragoon Ordo were both major influences to my work on Paper Aviator. Um, the last example I kind of wanted to cover was Linzo's Halloween Adventure, a 3D platformer I made with game designer Travis Van Essen for a Halloween game competition way back in 2013. Um, and so the game started as a way to make a 3D platformer in the vein of Super Mario 64. But we found after making the core 3D platformer gameplay and combat, the game was a little bit boring, with collecting candy and punching enemies being the entirety of our mechanics and really not providing much depth. Um, and so you can kind of see like what the initial vision of Linzo's Halloween Adventure looked like here, and just was a little simplistic for what we were going for the competition. And so Travis introduced the idea of me the idea to me to include a 2D segment so that our game's pacing and design were broken up a little bit, and it gave us a new area that could unlock costumes as well and further enhance the unlockable systems. And so we took this idea from Epic Mickey, which also featured gameplay from two dual perspectives throughout. And so you can see my work on Linzo's Halloween Adventure at the bottom. Here's the 3D section and the 2D section. And here's Epic Mickey's 3D section and then 2D section by comparison. And so ultimately, Linzo's Halloween Adventure became a 2D, 3D platformer hybrid, showcasing two different platformer styles and creating a fun, varied experience featuring a more combat-heavy third-person open-world area and a smaller timing and skill-based 2D platformer area. And the two mechanics mix together really well. So as I said earlier, my point in showcasing this is more to describe how emulating games you love can help you create and learn how to create your own unique game experiences. And working with a completely blank white slate can be really challenging, so letting the lessons your favorite games teach you act as a guide whenever you begin to explore making new game ideas is just really helpful, so that you have a kind of game foundation to kind of build your own vision on top of. I don't have many game development soapboxes to stand on, but one I do stand on is the importance of iteration to any creative product. If you've ever written an essay or created a piece of art, usually it takes multiple rounds to deliver the best version of your idea. And that in that way, game development and most creative work isn't very different. Most of the time, creating something new takes multiple revisions, and we call those revisions and process the iterative process. And I believe it's important to iterate to deliver the best and most complete version of your work. And so I'm going to share the iterative journey of a few games I've worked on. This is going back to Thunderjack's Log Runner. Here's a trailer of the finished game. While a fun, pretty twitchy mobile game at the end of its development, the beginnings of Thunderjack were far more simple. Way before Thunderjack became the twitchy arcade action game my team fell in love with, it started out as a paper diagram I made based off our producer's vision for the game. At this time, we did not have a dedicated designer on the team yet, but we'd hire one pretty quickly. Our producer came to us one morning explaining the concept of a mobile game where a player floated down a river while balancing on a barrel, and tapping each side of the screen corrected the player's balance, with the goal being to avoid falling for as long as possible. I drew up the diagram to depict those concepts and used it as a paper prototype to envision the game mechanics and the visualization of experiences early on. This was our very rough draft of Thunderjack's Log Runner. And so this is the paper prototype. The negative 15 and 15 kind of were my numerical minimum and maximums. And kind of my thinking was if a player's balance number. This 0 represents a balance number. If the balance number was 15 or greater, the player would fall over to the right. If the balance number was negative 15 or less, the player would fall off to the left. And by tapping the screen to the left or right, the player who is bouncing very much to the right, heavily to the right, would tap the left side of the screen to reduce the bounce number by 1. So if they were at 14, it would go back to 13 after tapping the left side of the screen. And then comparatively, if a player was leaning very hard to the left, they would tap the right side of the screen to increase the balance number, and to prevent the player from falling off to the left after getting negative 15 or less. And so this is just kind of a paper prototype kind of depicting and describing how the core mechanics underneath Thunderjack's log runner worked. After creating the paper prototype, I got a week to actually realize a rough version of a playable prototype for Thunderjack and its mechanics. Unfortunately, we didn't have any video of the playable prototype, but this is a screenshot of kind of what it looked like and how we used it in our future design mock-ups. I implemented a character whose goal it was to bounce on top of a ball, who constantly leaned to the left or right based on a gravity counter, which pushed them to the left or right at a constant rate. I implemented a fake wind prefab that could blow wind and help or hurt the player during the prototype experience, and I implemented a basic fish enemy that, when coming in contact with the player, forced them to lose automatically. And all those features were adjusted. I believe the wind was dropped, and the fish, instead of automatically killing the player, would just push them to the left or right, which made them much more forgiving. At its core, this prototype was the foundation of the gameplay and gave us a chance to explore whether the core game mechanics themselves were fun and interesting. This was really our revised draft and first actual gameplay experiment to see how the ideas worked together, and helped us define the core mechanics and later full experience of the game. Ultimately, our final version of the game included not just the surface balancing mechanics, but also bonus explorable areas, unlockable worlds, an underwater area which allowed for attacking enemy fish, a neat combo system, and much more. This is what the gradual evolution of Thunderjack looked like throughout the entirety of its creative process, with each iteration further cementing and solidifying the core ideas that made the final vision of Thunderjack exactly what it is. Our first paper prototype draft helped us outline the core mechanics and how we would frame the experience for the player. The second prototype rough draft iteration was our first initial prototype, where we tested getting the core mechanics to work together and saw how they intertwined and played with each other. And our last iteration of Thunderjack was the fully fleshed out multiple environment expanding experience we landed on. Just to clarify, it took way more than 3 versions of Thunderjack in order to get to that final vision. The full production of Thunderjack took a year and a half, and there were hundreds of versions before we finished, but as we iterated the game and its core features, we slowly solidified as we got to see and hear what worked best in the game. Moving on, I'm going to share an example of iteration in environment design. In addition to all the other stuff, I'm also a co-founder of the indie game company Weird Kid Studios, where we've been designing our VR action shooter Galactic Bar Fight as a team for a little over a year. One central part of our game's experiences is our central hub area, Pegasus Station. Pegasus acts as a home base for players to explore, be entertained, receive weapon and power-up reminders in the way of commercials, practice shooting or swinging weaponry, and is the place players return to after surviving enemy wave-based combat missions. Pegasus went through several iterations. Our first visual mock-up was just to help us develop a sense of scale where we'd like the main bar areas to be featured. The second iteration added a training room where players would do target practice and destroy enemy droids. And I will note, visually you can see our 3D artist Victor Villalobos had started texturing and defining the color scheme and overall look of our space station. So you can kind of see Victor kind of define and start to figure out how Pegasus looked here as we started to texture and kind of really fill out the space and add and expand the area a little bit. I believe we started to add multiple floors here. And the far right version brought everything together. It added a basement floor area where players return to their private quarters. We finalized our lighting and textures to fully complete the look, and we did our best to create lots of motion in the form of changing dancing digital performers, relaxed enemy NPCs drinking, laughing, and stretching, flickering TV screens, and more to make our space station seem more alive. Ultimately, I just wanted to share the visuals to showcase how the life really grew in our central hub area and how the iterations gradually expanded, not just visually and in terms of textures and lighting, but also our architecture needed to evolve as we realized player needs. And here we can see kind of the final vision of Pegasus, which you're getting a tour through with our AI droid Arya. The final example of the iterative process I want to showcases the evolution of blasters also in Galactic Barfight. The game went through several iterations, and in my very first, it was a stationary shooting gallery combat demo where enemies shot back at the player. In this version, I was building my first real gun shooting system, and the blasters were very vanilla, single-shot pistols, no matter which gun you selected. We launched our first prototype with these blasters, and the players found them very dull, if I'm honest. So when we began to make a more full production experience, I rebuilt the weapon system and expanded it to include things such as firing rate, being able to shoot multiple projectiles in a spread from a single shot, parameters such as projectile flight speed, and more. And you can see the upgrade in the much more interesting and useful example of the shotgun I made. And kind of, I made this to kind of show my designer some of the values you would adjust to create a gun using this weapon system I built. And then the final version of the weapons system I built kind of focused on the new blaster system. The final version of the weapons built on the new blaster system also included special projectile types. So I added weapons that shot projectiles that could dissolve or slice enemies as well. This added a cool layer of visual feedback on top of the more interesting and varied weapon spreads, and gave us the ability to make what I believe are the most interesting weapons in the game. And so you can kind of see this demolisher weapon, which is kind of, or obliterator, which is dissolving enemies into particles in the arena. And so as I've shared all these examples of iteration in my work, I hope it helps you in appreciating the value of testing your ideas and going back to the drawing board to make okay ideas into good ideas and turn those good ideas into great ideas. And then the last thing I wanted to discuss today involves sharing your work, and what I would say is the value of sharing your work with others early and often. So I want to first say that I fully understand sharing unfinished and imperfect work can be very intimidating. The last thing you want to do is share something you obsessed over and have it be torn apart by others. However, I myself have received many opportunities and made connections with all sorts of creatives and even non-creatives as I've continued to share my work more and more, which is a huge reason I'm making this video in the hopes of meeting even more creatives. I'm a huge fan of Screenshot Saturday and any opportunity developers from all skill sets and positions have to share their work. And for those who don't know, if you look up on Twitter, there's a hashtag Screenshot Saturday hashtag. You can kind of see it here that really is really popular on Saturday, in which game developers from all over the world and all skill sets contribute to. I also tend to share to hashtag game dev. I use Unity a lot, so made with Unity and the indie game dev hashtag as well. So I'm a huge fan of Screenshot Saturday and any opportunity developers from all skill sets and positions have to share their work. I'm a frequent contributor and sharer to Screenshot Saturday and various indie developer groups, and it has allowed me to slowly build community, connect to other creatives, get advice from people who have more experience than me, and in general just made me feel more like I'm a developer and a definite part of the game industry. These are some of the images I've shared from over the years of my work, and what I found is people love to be a part of a creative journey, and by sharing your progress, you give them that opportunity. By sharing and participating in developers' social media events and online groups, I've had opportunities to create content that's gotten thousands of views for my games, and even been able to connect with some of the game creators I respect the most. Um, in them, in the screenshot in the middle, you can see the analytic breakdown for a Twitter post I made where I talked about my indie game, and see thousands of eyes that my posts had been in front of, just from participating in the Screenshot Saturday hashtag that weekend. On top of that, to the far right is an example of Seamus Blackley, an infamous game industry system architect who spearheaded development on the original Xbox, complementing a promotional screenshot of our indie game Galactic Bar Fight, comparing it to cult classic System Shock visually, and to say that me and my team were overjoyed to receive such high praise from such a talented and experienced creative is an understatement. So not only can you talk to other growing and learning developers, but sharing your work and putting yourself out there can help you speak to and connect to the game industry leaders you respect and admire too. So as we wrap up the talk, I just want to recap some of the points I was working to get across throughout this presentation. Design is all about building the game mechanics and interactions that make up a game experience. And oftentimes, those mechanics mix and match and really work together to create variety, complexity, and strategy in games. So an important skill for any game designer is to be able to define and consider the marriage between the various mechanics that power their game. Secondly, programming at its heart is all about writing instructions that the system processes and uses to drive a game experience. Simple interactions on the player end, such as press A to low kick and press X to high kick, have instructions running in the background which connect the player input to in-game action, and sometimes it works vice versa, where an in-game event happens and the system notifies the player, such as in Thunderjack's Log Runner. And so, at its core, programming is just about instructions. Third, learning by emulating your favorite games is perfectly fine, and this goes beyond just programming and game design. It also applies to music, art, and really, a lot of the times, the best way to define your own style is to use the rules and ideas that some of your favorite creators already had in mind for their games. I, for example, am a huge Shigeru Miyamoto fan and utilize the many things his games have taught me as guidelines to build my own games. Don't be afraid to mimic the work you love already. Third, the iteration is an invaluable part of the development process. Just like writing a paper, it can take hundreds, if not thousands, of drafts. We call them builds in games, but different versions to make your game into the best experience it can be. And the iterations can change in look, functionality, design, depth, or more. Give your game the chance to grow into the game that you really want to make. That's what iteration's all about. And lastly, share your work early and often. I know it can be intimidating and scary, but it also can open you to a wealth of opportunities as people try to join you on your creative journey. And in closing, I'd like to say thank you so much for watching the presentation. I hope you found it helpful and encouraging, and I absolutely enjoyed sharing some of my experiences of being a professional nerd with you. Please feel free to contact and reach out to me at the following links. I will include some other links to my portfolio and various works and resources in the video description below, and I hope you have an excellent rest of your day. Thank you and have a great one.